Today marks a very special anniversary date, the day the beloved Cloudland Ballroom opened in 1940 at its former site in Bowen Hills. Representing a bygone era and occasions of dances, debutantes and events, this iconic architectural and social structure is still fondly remembered by many. So, Dr James Lergessner, our guest speaker today, will be sharing his many years in research on this site, revealing how much of an impact it made on a generation. Dr Lergessner is a published author and historian with over 25 works, including the first book to be published on Cloudland. So to take us back in time, please welcome Dr James Lergessner.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. You see the cover of this book, which was an initial book that was put out before Buralong Press put theirs out. You can see the dome, and you can see at times it was blue or pink, but that dome was 80 feet tall, and it basically was constructed upon telephone poles. More about that later. This is the fellow who was responsible for Cloudland, Thomas Eslick. He was born in 1887 in England, and he was what you call an impresario. In other words, he was an event manager, and he went around to 46 places and was responsible for a number of different events. Okay, so Thomas was involved in the Portobello Marine Park in Edinburgh, which was also a zoological centre. The Indian Durbar, which was put on for the Rajas of India by the King and Queen of England. The Luna Park at Melbourne in 1912, he was involved in that, and that became a template for Luna Park Cloudland. The La Monica Ballroom in California. Now, La Monica Ballroom in California was out over a big pier and basically it had a sprung floor. So that's where we get the idea, first of all, for the sprung floor, which I'll talk about later. He then went on to a Florida land scheme, and his boss threw himself over the front of a Cunard liner, never to be seen again. With Thomas Eslick, as you'll find out, there's a certain amount of exaggeration and there's a certain amount of flair with what he did. He ends up at Lotus Isle, which was an amusement park in Oregon. And while in 1938, he comes to Brisbane with the idea that, okay, I've done 46 things, but I want to do a 47th. This is where I'm going to stay. I'm going nowhere else. 1938, he's in Brisbane. So he goes to the Tivoli, which we all know. And if you look at the bottom of the next slide, it says right at the bottom, yours radiantly. Give you an idea of the type of individual that we're dealing with. Yeah, and so he was still organising events, song and dance routines, all that sort of stuff. These images are quite interesting because it says that it opens in July 1939. Now, the first sod was turned in March of 1939. So this edifice was going to be up and running, a 3-storey building with a cafe at the top, an observation tower in the middle, and then the dance floor at the bottom. It was going to be ready in a couple of months. Unbelievable. And if you look at the next slide, you can see clearly he says it's going to be ready by July of 1939. So 1939, as we know, was a war year. And what he decided to do with the Board of Governors for the government project, which was Cloudland, was to float 20,000 £1 shares. And here's the prospectus. So you can see on the prospectus, you can see the dome, you can see the funicular railway lines, you can see some of the Corinthian columns, which were really hollow, and there were about 12 of them. So everything was kind of like what you see rather than what really was. And so this was floated and it was taken up. The difficulty is 1939 is a war year. So the project had union problems, construction problems, a flood came in, a fire, there were break-ins, there were all sorts of problems with it. And as you can see with the next slide, we know for certain, although Thomas Eslick was a con man, that for sure, given this particular slide, all of the employees thanking him for what he's done. So we know for certain that this is rigidage, this is legitimate. In 1941, he gets browned off because the shares go from £1 down to 1 shilling down to sixpence. And he thinks, well, what am I going to do with this project? And of course, the Board of Governors gets rid of him, and he ends up in a law court in Brisbane, again, filed for bankruptcy. So he had everything followed him from England, where he had bankruptcy problems as well. And so he goes, with this particular slide, he goes to the Courier Mail and he says, look, I am browned off with Western society. I want to form a utopian society and I want to do it in the Pacific. And he gets 24 takers and he does nothing about it and crawls back to Oregon in the States. Now, we know what happens around about December of 1941 because we know that the American garrison comes into Brisbane with General MacArthur. We also know that Cloudland gets a little bit of a change. It becomes Camp Luna Park, and it has a number of different groups in it, photography, signals, engineers, and a dispensary for pharmaceutical products. So you can see there some of the engineering truck was there, and then you can see here where it is in Bowen Hills. It's basically to the left of that orange area that says Montpelier Hill. So it's right up on top of a boutique suburb. Keep that in mind, that it's in boutique suburb, congested with people when they knock it down, when I tell you about that. Here it is during World War II. And the Americans, of course, befriended a lot of mums and dads. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Chocolates, nylon stockings, closed events at Cloudland because it was the American garrison. You can see over on the left side, you can see all the bunks with obviously mosquito nets. And then to the right of that, you see the volleyball court where they held the dances. So it's kind of interesting to see this because on the second level, you see the balcony, and the balcony is going to become very, very important in the 50s and 60s when people make their debut, because the girl is down dancing with the fellow that he's chosen, and the parents are up behind the column looking to see that the guy is doing the right thing by knowing all the dance steps and doing, everything it's supposed to. So we come to today, August the 2nd, 1947, and we find that Cloudland passes to owners for the first time, Francis Rausch and Maya Winter. Now, they are what you called in those days spinsters, and they took Cloudland over and bought it off the government for £20,000. Now, remember what I said before, 20,000 £1 shares. So they got it as a bit of a gift. And here is the band shell. This is the way it looked like. And you can see down below, there are alcoves where people the girls would sit and the boys would come over and ask them for a dance. What was interesting was at a PMG ball, they set up telephone cables, and you could actually phone the girl and say, "Excuse me," you know. So it saved a little bit of embarrassment. So here we are with the actual promo, for the opening of Cloudland. We had the Billy Romaine Orchestra, and a lot of you put your hand up if you heard of Bill O'Smith. Yes, ring a bell. He was the other man who was there and stayed with Cloudland till 1957. We had some Luna Park things. We had a few amusements, but mainly we had the dancing. And this gives you an idea of how Cloudland looked. There wasn't a lot to do with landscaping in the 1940s, as you can see. And then...
Was the tram running there?
Sorry?
Was the tram running there?
I'll come to that. So we come to 1947, and with the opening, Luna Park is taken off the title. So it is only Cloudland, and as you can see in the next slide, we've got the crescent moon, where a lot of people, you know, had their photograph taken. And then this is my sister, Leslie Tissington, who lives in Canada. And she said, "Please don't use that." She's not here. So her partner was Ben Mellon, and he was the Queensland middleweight wrestling champion. So I never ever gave him any grief at all. In 1954, you know what happened pretty much when we go through this. Glenn Ford was in a movie called Blackboard Jungle. It came out in 1954, and it came to Cloudland round about 1956. But in 54, when it came out, Hans Appel, a German immigrant, took over Cloudland from Winters and Rausch, and he bought it for £16,000. So it went down in value. The interesting thing was, by this time in 1954, it was 16 years old, and well, because of that, he decided to paint inside and out. He put in a ticket office. He put in the important panorama room, which became a place for weddings and receptions and so on. And he also, around the ceiling, was blue and gelled like a decal strip, and he replaced that as well. So what we have, and I'm sure we've got in the audience, we've got bodgies, widgies, teenagers, juvenile delinquents, nashos, and the roped off section at Cloudland. So here we are, and this is before the Buddy Holly concert at Cloudland, but this is Bill Haley and the Comets at the Brisbane Stadium. Now, this was January in 1957, so you can understand that the discussion in the Courier Mail was, well, we've got a whole lot of police coming to the Brisbane Stadium because a lot of these children, they're into devil worship, and they're moving their hips, and they're doing all these things with the dancers and so on. So, yeah. Around about the end of the 50s, 3 boys from Redcliffe, who am I talking about? Bee Gees. They came to Cloudland, and Hans Appel met up with Barry after the song contest and said, "Barry, you 3 boys did very well, but for the next time, can you ask the boys to wear shoes?" True story. Here we have Rock and Roll George Kyprios, who died in 2009, aged 82. He had a different pair of stovepipe trousers on. He's got the purple ones on. Sometimes he had the lime green and the red and the black and so on. He had an FX Holden, and he was a fixture at Cloudland. So we come to a very, very important celebration. Why are we at Cloudland? The Lee Gordon Tour is coming to Brisbane. The Brisbane Stadium is being knocked over to make way for the Festival Hall, and so he goes to Cloudland and he brings Paul Anka, Jerry Lee Lewis, Jodie Sands and Johnny O'Keefe. Quite a lineup, quite a lineup. The critics said that Paul Anka and Jodie Sands, Jodie Sands had a song out, All I Want to Do Is Love You, and it was like in the top 100. So she wasn't as well known as the others, but they said that Paul Anka and Jodie Sands were quite tame, and Buddy Holly, when he came out, he looked uncomfortable through his dark, his horn-rimmed black glasses. And one of the critics said the concert sounded like 100 off-key instruments. So here we have the actual floor plan of Cloudland on the night at 6:30 and 8 o'clock. We had people paying 19 shillings and 29 shillings. Now, you look at that now, you're looking probably about $70 for the big tickets. And so it was pretty well full up. And here was the band shell that they would have gone with. And also, here's Jerry Lee Lewis on the night at Cloudland. And of course, Jerry Lee Lewis, being the sort of guy that he was, he went around Brisbane to all the record stores. And what we have with Cloudland is a little bit of a golden moment as a writer, when you actually find out there's a winter dance party on in the United States. Over Iowa, in a cornfield, the big bopper, J.P. Richardson, comes down in the cornfield with Buddy Holly and Richie Valens, La Bomba. So the three of them come down, and obviously they decided not to go on the tour bus, which didn't have any heating, and Waylon Jennings actually swapped with the big bopper, J.P. Richardson, and he never got over it until he died. And Tommy Allsop, who was the bass player for Buddy Holly, he swapped seats with Richie Valens. So originally Tommy Allsop had the seat on the plane, gave it to Richie Valens, who'd never been on a plane before, and boom, they came down. When Jay Richardson came to Brisbane probably about 20 years ago, I talked to him and he said there was a really bad situation developed afterwards. And I said, well, what was it? He said, well, I thought that maybe the big bopper, my father J.P. Richardson and Buddy Holly, got into an altercation mid-air, and that they might find a revolver in the cornfields. So they opened the big bopper's casket, and he'd been dead for 4 years. Now, as you know, in the States, they really seal them, and he was in good shape. But there was no bullet wound, there was only cuts, abrasions and breaks. So it had a really strange end. And then, if you remember, a song came out called American. Yep. It had a line in it, the day the music died. Yeah, so Don McLean, he put it out and goes on for about 9 minutes. We come to the funicular railway. It was an alpine railway, and it was there when Camp Luna Park was there, for obvious reasons, because they could use it to bring up armaments up the hill. It was often said that if you had to walk up the hill, and I had to do it every now and again, I wasn't ready for the barn dance. I was tuckered.
I agree with you.
Yeah, so it was difficult. So it went 100 yards in the old measure up the hill. It took 30 people and 30 people down. Now, the funicular railway, you've heard of Alex Gow? Does that ring a bell? Funeral person. So he asked if he could go underneath the floor and check the spring in the floor. When he actually got under the floor, he found out that the spotty gum, which was hardwood on top, was all coming away. There were no springs as such, but it had been closely tampered with nails, and because of the rise of the twist and the stomp and all those things. The middle was starting to cave in over the tops of the piers and the joists. So a lot of that was what he found out, and it was kind of interesting that the Americans had replaced the spotty gum floor on top of the old tongue and groove floor. So we come to the 60s and we've still got the traditional things going with the bands. We come to also the balls, and of course we had teachers' balls and medical balls and so on. And then we come to Ivan Damon, Ivan Daisy as he was called. So he comes with Pat Alton and he comes to Cloudland and he sees an old fellow there calling the Canadian three-step, the Pride of Erin and waltzes, and it's on a chalkboard. And he says to Pat Alton, says to him, "What do you think is going on here?" And Ivan Damon said, "You watch, you see what I do." And so obviously Cloudland had to change. So what he did, Ivan Damon, was set up the Sunshine record label with Johnny O'Keefe and Normie Rowe. So Normie Rowe is still a favourite with the senior ladies and the men as well. So here we have like a teacher's ball, and if you look to the right-hand side, eventually you will see a rope up the top, and that would be where the dancers were. Mick Hadley from the Purple Hearts. I was talking to Mick about doing a biography of him. We were good mates, and unfortunately he passed away. The Hucklebucks. I jammed a lot with the Hucklebucks, performed with them every now and again, and there they are, the Hucklebucks. And of course, a lot of people, and I was talking to Bill, did examinations in 1960s, about 10-year period for QUT and UQ, and was quite interesting too that Miss Queensland was crowned and then on one night, and then had to turn up for the examinations the next day, and that brought it roundly back to earth. So we're coming towards the end of what is, I hope, is an interesting talk. In the 1970s, you would know what happened, particularly out this way. There were a lot of new suburbs. With the new suburbs, we had taverns, we had bowling clubs, we had hotels, nightclubs, discos for children. You could meet the band of your dreams, the love of your life, get a skinful of alcohol and basically not have to drive all the way in to Cloudland. So Cloudland was, we might say, was on very feeble legs by this time, and being on top of Bowen Hills, yes. And you can also see that what was happening. So what was happening in the Courier Mail in the 60s, 1962, there was a big headline, debris, 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 in decline. In other words, debutante balls in decline. So what we had were these particular dances. We had the locomotion, the stomp, the frug, the bump, the monkey, the swim, the funky chicken, and mashed potato and go-go dances. So we had all these things happening in Cloudland and taking a toll on the floor. At one time, Sounds of Seven, during the floods in Brisbane in 1970, were playing with water up to their knees. So the ceiling was starting to give way. So here we have also, you can see there where the roped off section is. So you have your beautiful traditional ballroom couples, and then you've got the other people kicking their legs out and doing rock and roll. So in 1977, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth came to Brisbane. A big problem for Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who was in power from 1968 to 1987. What was the problem? The problem was the ceiling was starting to flake and Her Majesty may get something in her eye. So we'll put a canopy over the ceiling. Oh, there's cracks in the floor. Let's put bowls of gladiolis to cover it up. And then the floor's starting to cave in. Why don't we put Q-rail brown carpet on the floor? So away we went, and we got through that, and Her Majesty didn't notice a thing. But Cloudland was on life support. It gets its final owner, Peter Kurtz. Peter Kurtz in 1974 bought Cloudland for $700,000. He decided to renovate. He was still losing patronage because he couldn't sell alcohol. What was happening was bands like Cold Chisel were going to Cloudland, coming out of there, yahooing with the crowd, and the crowd was also involuntarily watering people's places, if you get my drift, and using bad language. So there was a bit of a problem with getting that. So, yeah. So what did he do? He said, what I'll do is I'll put backsides on seats. I'll get Midnight Oil, I'll get AC/DC, I'll get some American groups, I'll get people, The Clash from England, whatever we'll do. And we'll also diversify. We'll use Mitre 10 and have a seminar. We'll have a disco for the children. We'll have a nightclub for the adults. We'll go more with weddings and receptions, and we'll use everything we can. But the big problem was they did a market in 1978. And I was at that market and I thought, oh, gee, you've slipped. You know, what the hell is going on? So here we go. These were the sort of things that they were doing, getting people to come to these big events and pay big money to do it. And here we have the Mitre 10 on the left-hand side. That was the seminar. And then also, you know, we got cheap Chinese things sold in an op shop and people coming and doing it all. Here's Peter Kurtz, avid sailor, the late Peter Kurtz, and the last owner of Cloudland. So we had groups like the Saints, the Angels, the Stray Cats, Brian Seltzer from the Stray Cats, still going. The Ramones, bring them over, American groups. And then we also had the Clash. Now, Joe Strummer got out on stage and said, Brisbane is Pig City. And everyone said, what the hell is he talking about? What he was saying was Sir Joe had stopped street marches without a permit. And so it was Pig City. It was controlled by police. Then Bob Weatherall, who I spoke to at length about this, he got up on stage and said, you better watch out, Brisbane. October, November 1982, we're going to have the Commonwealth Games and we're going to talk about land rights and we're going to protest. It was really interesting. And there was a fight broke out between the skinheads and the others on that night. So anyway, it gave rise to a local band called Pig City and some of the others as well. So we come now to the final death throes of Cloudland, 7th of November 1982. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the people of Bowen Hills woke up to the sound of things being knocked over. What had happened is the Dean brothers had got into the establishment the night before or the day before, and what they had done was they had cut through the telephone poles on the dome and put a chain on the top around that, ready to just pull it over when they came in on the 7th of November. And I talked to, because, you know, I'm a musician myself, I talked to George Sava from Gingerbread. He said, we were doing a show, he said, and it was starting to get dark. And I said to the lighting guy, what the hell's going on? Can you put a bit of light? We got the last song. He beckoned him over to where the lights were, and all the wiring had been cut. So the Dean brothers had got in and knocked over all the wiring. So real big problem. So what we had was something like 6,250 tonnes of asbestos cement came round. So the Deans, I wouldn't like to have their lung capacity at the moment. And you can see that the panorama room is still standing, like the shoebox. That was the place, you know, for weddings and receptions. But it was, all of this was knocked over. And you can see the painted ladies, you can see the Corinthian columns, and the painted ladies are now, some of them, there are ephemera down at the Cloudland nightclub. A lot of our younger people think that the Cloudland nightclub was Cloudland. No, sorry, no. So here it is, yeah, and we've got people making that, and you can see the desolation of the site. You can see on the bottom one where they've got the Cloudland apartments. You can see in the next one, can you see right down on the bottom left-hand corner, there's a brown patch there? Well, that's where I've usually gone on the 7th of November with ABC Radio, the old steps of the old Cloudland, and went live to air from there. So that's the Cloudland apartments. And of course, what have we got? Well, we've got the Gateway, we've got the City Hall, and we've got the Story Bridge. Not much, is it? And then, of course, we've got on Cintra Hill things like this medallion up there. So that gives you the story of Cloudland. I hope you enjoyed it. I had to really go through it to have enough time for questions or comments or anything that you wanted to say.